A young girl is followed by a peculiar crow. As her parents try to shoo it away, they discover a stunning explanation for the crow's behavior. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Emma's backyard as she sat cross-legged in the grass, her attention fixed on an unusual visitor. A large black crow, bigger than any she'd seen before, hopped from one maple branch to another, keeping its dark eyes trained on her. Unlike the other birds that usually scattered when she came outside to play, this one seemed deliberately following her movements. Emma tilted her head, studying the crow's glossy feathers that shimmered with hints of blue and purple in the sunlight. Every time she moved to a different part of the yard, the crow would flutter to a new perch, maintaining its watchful presence. She found herself less afraid than curious about this strange behavior. In the garage nearby, Jake Morrison adjusted the wind gauge on his home weather station, frowning at the readings. The barometer showed a sharp drop in pressure, and the wind had picked up considerably in the last hour. Looking up through the garage door, he noticed the sky transforming. What had been scattered white clouds were now merging into an ominous dark mass, moving faster than typical storm systems in this part of the country. Jake checked his phone's weather radar, comparing it to his equipment readings. Something about this approaching storm didn't match the usual patterns he'd documented over his years as an amateur meteorologist. The wind direction was erratic, and the temperature fluctuations weren't following normal pre-storm behavior. From the back porch, Emily watched her daughter with growing concern. The clouds overhead had taken on an unsettling greenish tinge, and the wind was starting to whip through the trees with increasing force. "Emma," she called out, her voice carrying a note of urgency. "Time to come inside, sweetheart. Storm's coming." Emma remained rooted in place, her gaze locked with the crows. The bird had moved to a lower branch, and as thunder rumbled in the distance, it let out a harsh, penetrating caw that seemed to echo through the yard. The sound wasn't the typical crow call. It carried a different quality, almost like a word trying to form. "Just a minute, Mom," Emma called back, not wanting to break this strange connection. The crow, which she had already secretly named Sombra in her mind, cawed again, more insistently this time. The sound made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. It felt like a warning, though of what, she couldn't say. Emily stepped off the porch, her anxiety mounting as the wind began to gust stronger. "Emma now," she insisted, her eyes darting between her daughter and the threatening sky above. The trees were beginning to bend and sway, their leaves turning upward to show their pale undersides, a sure sign of an approaching storm. As Emma finally stood to go inside, Sombra spread its wings and let out another cry, this one so loud and clear it made both Emma and Emily jump. The bird's call cut through the rising wind like a knife. Carrying what seemed impossible to deny was genuine urgency. Emma felt tears spring to her eyes, though she couldn't explain why. Something about that cry spoke directly to her heart, awakening feelings she didn't understand. The first fat droplets of rain began to fall as Emma reluctantly turned toward the house. She glanced back one last time at Sombra, who remained perched on the branch, rain beating on its feathers, its dark eyes fixed on her with an intelligence that seemed far beyond that of an ordinary bird. In that moment, Emma knew with absolute certainty that this was more than a chance encounter. This was the beginning of something extraordinary. Inside the house, Emma pressed her face against the living window, watching Sombra, who remained perched on the branch despite the increasingly heavy rain. Jake hung his jacket by the door, running a hand through his damp hair as he joined his daughter at the window. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "your grandmother used to tell me something about crows. She said they were messengers between our world and—" He trailed off, suddenly aware of Emily's sharp look from across the room. They had agreed not to encourage Emma's tendency toward fantastic ideas, especially after the incidents at school where her vivid imagination had caused some concern among her teachers. "Can't we let him in?" Emma pleaded, turning to face her parents. "He's getting all wet out there." Her small hands pressed against the glass as another thunderclap shook the house. The crow remained steadfast, water streaming off its feathers, its dark eyes fixed on their window with unnerving focus. Emily moved through the room, methodically closing windows and drawing curtains. "Honey, we can't bring wild animals into the house. The crow will find shelter if it needs to." She tried to keep her voice steady, but there was an edge to it. Something about the bird's behavior unsettled her deeply, though she couldn't explain why. "But he's not just any crow," Emma insisted, her voice rising with frustration. "He's special. He's trying to tell us something." As if in response to her words, Sombra let out another harsh cry that somehow carried clearly through the closed window and the sound of rain. Jake moved to the kitchen, checking his weather instruments again. The readings made less and less sense. The barometer showed pressure changes that should be impossible for their region, and the wind direction was spinning like a compass near a magnet. He pulled up the local weather radar on his tablet, but the storm pattern didn't match anything in his years of amateur meteorology. The wind picked up dramatically, making the house creak and groan. Emma watched as leaves and small branches whipped past the window. Through it all, Sombra remained, somehow maintaining his perch despite gusts that should have sent any bird flying for cover. "We need to close all the upstairs windows," Emily announced, heading for the stairs. She paused at the bottom step, looking back at Emma, who hadn't moved from her vigil at the window. "Emma, come help me, please. We need to get the house secured." But Emma stood transfixed. Sombra had shifted position, moving to a branch closer to the house. Despite the chaos of the storm around him, his gaze remained locked on Emma with an intensity that seemed to communicate something just beyond her understanding. She felt tears welling up again, a mixture of frustration and something deeper, a sense that something important was happening and the adults just couldn't see it. Jake returned from the kitchen, his face creased with concern. "The weather service just issued a severe storm warning," he announced, checking his phone. "They're saying this system came out of nowhere. It's not following any normal pattern." A particularly violent gust rattled the windows, making them all jump. Emma pressed her hands harder against the glass, as if trying to reach through it to the crow outside. "Please," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to her parents or to Sombra. "Please listen." The crow spread its wings, water droplets flying off like silver beads in the storm light. Its cry this time was different, lower, longer, almost like a song. The sound seemed to fill the room despite the closed window, making both Jake and Emily freeze in their tracks. For a moment, the only sounds were the storm outside and that strange, haunting call. Then the power went out, plunging them in a storm-dark twilight, and Emma could have sworn she saw Sombra's eyes glowing in the darkness. Lightning flashed across the darkened house, briefly illuminating Emma's bedroom, whereas he had retreated after her parents insisted she move away from the downstairs windows. She lay on her bed, watching the storm through the rain-streaked glass. Each flash revealed Sombra, who had somehow followed her upstairs, maintaining his position on a branch near her window. The house shuddered with another thunderclap, and Emma pulled her knees closer to her chest. But it wasn't fear that made her tremble. It was anticipation. Every time lightning lit up the sky, she could see Sombra more clearly. The crow's eyes seemed to glow with an inner light, and his calls had taken on a rhythm that felt almost like language. Downstairs, Jake and Emily huddled around the kitchen table, their faces lit by emergency candles. The battery-powered weather radio crackled with static between announcements, describing a storm system that meteorologists couldn't explain. Jake's own instruments, running on backup power, showed readings that defied everything he knew about weather patterns. "Remember that story about the Thompson's dog?" Emily said suddenly, her voice barely audible above the storm. "How it kept barking at their basement wall until they finally checked and found a gas leak?" She twisted her hands in her lap, looking up toward Emma's room. "And the Wilson's cat that woke them up during that electrical fire?" Jake nodded slowly, understanding where his wife's thoughts were heading. "Animals sense things we don't," he admitted. "My grandfather used to tell me about a horse that saved their whole family during a tornado. Broke right out of its stable and kept kicking their door until they woke up." Another flash of lightning, another boom of thunder. Through the ceiling, they could hear Emma's voice and something else. The distinctive sound of Sombra's calls, somehow clear despite the closed windows and howling wind. "It's trying to tell me something," Emma whispered to herself, pressing closer to the window. The crow's calls had changed again, becoming more urgent. Between lightning flashes, she could see it hopping along the branch, spreading its wings, then folding them again, as if demonstrating something. The rain intensified, hammering against the roof like thousands of tiny fists. Wind howled through the trees, creating a whistling sound that seemed to harmonize with Sombra's calls. Emma found herself humming along, a melody she didn't recognize but somehow knew. Jake and Emily appeared in her doorway, their faces ghostly in the storm light. They watched their daughter, who seemed to be in a world of her own, swaying slightly as she hummed that strange tune. Outside, Sombra's calls matched her rhythm perfectly. "I did some quick research on my phone," Jake said quietly to Emily. "Did you know crows are considered some of the most intelligent birds? They can solve complex problems, recognize human faces, even use tools." He paused as another lightning flash illuminated the room. "And there are stories, legends really, about crows acting as guides, protectors." Emily squeezed his hand, her skepticism warring with what she was witnessing. The crow outside their daughter's window was behaving like no wild animal she'd ever seen. Its presence felt deliberate, purposeful. "Look!" Emma suddenly called out, pointing through the window. In the next lightning flash, they all saw it. Sombra had arranged a pattern of small branches on a larger limb, creating what looked remarkably like an arrow pointing toward the old woods behind their house. The crow's next cry was the loudest yet, cutting through the storm like a knife. Emma turned to her parents, her eyes wide and serious. "He's been trying to show us something," she said with absolute certainty. "And I think we're running out of time." The house creaked ominously around them, and the wind changed direction again, making the windows rattle in their frames. In that moment, watching their daughter commune with this mysterious crow while a storm raged around them, Jake and Emily faced a choice: dismiss this as childhood fantasy, or accept that something extraordinary was unfolding before their eyes. Sombra called again, the sound now unmistakably urgent, almost pleading. And this time, all three of them felt it, the undeniable sense that this was more than just a storm, more than just a bird. Something was coming, and somehow, this crow was their only guide. Dawn broke over the neighborhood, revealing a landscape transformed by the night storm. Jake led his family outside to survey the damage, Emma bouncing anxiously beside him while Emily followed more cautiously. The morning air felt unusually crisp and clean, as if the storm had washed away more than just debris. Branches and leaves littered the streets, and several trees had lost major limbs. The Morrisons' yard had fared better than most, though their garden fence lay partially collapsed. As they walked down their driveway, Emma's head swiveled constantly, searching for Sombra. A soft caw from above drew their attention. The crow sat perched on their mailbox, preening his feathers as if nothing unusual had happened. In the morning light, his feathers showed even more clearly that unusual blue-purple sheen Emma had noticed before. "Emma!" called a voice from down the street. Tommy Chun, their 10-year-old neighbor, was running toward them, followed by his younger sister Lucy. Behind them, other neighborhood children began emerging from their houses, drawn by the scene of Emma and the unusual crow. "Is it true?" Tommy asked breathlessly, skidding to a stop. "Mom said your crow warned you about the storm." Word had already spread through the neighborhood parents' text group about the strange behavior of the crow at the Morrison house. More children gathered around, forming a semicircle at a respectful distance from Sombra, who remained calmly perched on the mailbox. The crow seemed completely at ease with the attention, occasionally turning his head to study the growing crowd with intelligent eyes. "He's not exactly my crow," Emma began, then stopped as Sombra hopped down from the mailbox to land on the ground near her feet. The other children gasped. Lucy Chin clutched her brother's arm, eyes wide with wonder. Jake watched as his daughter carefully knelt next to the bird. She'd always been special, sensitive the teachers called it, but this was something else entirely. The crow's behavior defied everything he knew about wild animals. He tried to warn us, Emma explained to her growing audience. He knew the storm was coming, but it wasn't just that. She looked up at her parents, seeking permission to continue. When they nodded, she went on, he was trying to show us something in the woods, but the old woods behind your house, interrupted Sarah Miller, a sixth grader from 2 streets over. My grandma says those woods are special. She says they've always attracted unusual animals. As if responding to Sarah's words, Sombra spread his wings and performed a short hop flight to land on a low branch of their front yard maple tree. The movement sent ripples of excitement through the gathered children. Mrs. Chen appeared at her front door, then quickly walked over to join the other adults who had begun to gather, drawn by the cluster of children. She carried her phone, already recording the scene. That's no ordinary bird, she declared, zooming in on Sombra. Look at how it behaves. And those markings, I've never seen a crow quite like that. Emma stood up, brushing grass from her knees. He protected us, she said firmly, her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. During the worst of the storm, he stayed outside my window. He tried to tell us something was wrong with the storm, that it wasn't natural. She paused, then added more quietly, and I think he's still trying to tell us something. The adults exchanged glances, their usual skepticism warring with what they were witnessing. The crow's behavior was undeniably strange, and after last night's inexplicable storm, they were more open to unusual possibilities. Sombra called out again, the sound somehow different in the morning light. Less urgent, but no less meaningful. Several children jumped, then giggled nervously. The crow's call seemed to hang in the air, like the last note of a song. You know, Mr. Miller said, joining the group, they say crows never forget a face. They pass information about people down through generations. They're probably the smartest birds in the world. Emma looked up at Sombra, who met her gaze with those impossibly knowing eyes. In that moment, she understood that what had started as a strange encounter in her backyard had become something bigger. The story of the crow, who warned of the storm, was already spreading through the neighborhood, but Emma knew this was just the beginning. Sombra took flight, circling once over the gathered crowd before landing on a higher branch. From this new perch, he seemed to survey them all, like a guardian keeping watch. The morning sun caught his feathers, and for a moment, he seemed to glow with an inner light that made Emma catch her breath. The legend of Emma and her crow had begun. Emma sat cross-legged on her bed, a brand-new journal open in her lap. The leather-bound book had been a gift from Mrs. Chun, who insisted that extraordinary events should be properly documented. With careful precision, Emma wrote at the top of the first page the truth about Sombra. Outside her window, the crow in question perched on his now familiar branch, watching as she sketched his likeness with colored pencils. Emma paid special attention to the blue-purple sheen of his feathers. Something she noticed became more pronounced when he was trying to communicate something important. Day 3, she wrote beneath the drawing. Sombra showed me where the Johnson's cat was stuck in their garage today. Nobody heard it crying because they were all at work, but Sombra kept flying between me and their house until I followed him. Now everyone's calling him the guardian crow. At school, Emma had become the center of attention. During recess, children gathered around her picnic table, bringing their lunches to hear stories about Sombra. Even the older kids, who usually ignored the younger ones, started joining these impromptu gatherings. Tell us about the storm again, they'd beg, and Emma would describe how Sombra had stayed through the night, how his calls had matched the strange melody she'd heard in the wind. Some kids shared their own family stories about animals that had done remarkable things, but none quite matched the ongoing mystery of Sombra. In his home office, Jake sat surrounded by open books and his laptop, deep in research. What had started as casual curiosity had evolved into a serious investigation. His browser tabs were filled with scholarly articles about corvid intelligence, cultural mythology about crows, and historical accounts of animals exhibiting unexplainable behavior. He'd found references to crows in nearly every culture's mythology. Native American legends spoke of them as spirit guides. Norse mythology connected them to prophecy and protection. Japanese folklore portrayed them as divine messengers. The more he read, the more he understood that humanity's relationship with these birds went far deeper than he'd imagined. "Listen to this," he called to Emily, who was passing by with a laundry basket. There's a documented case from 1932 where a family's pet crow repeatedly blocked their front door, preventing them from leaving. That same morning, their regular route to work was destroyed by a landslide. Emily set down the basket, her skepticism fading more each day. "I found something too," she admitted. "I was talking to Emma's teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez. She said her grandmother used to tell stories about spirit crows in her village. In Mexico, they were supposed to appear when significant changes were coming." Jake made another note in his growing file. The similarities between different cultures' crow legends couldn't be coincidence, especially not with what they were witnessing firsthand. Meanwhile, Emma's journal filled with daily observations. She noted how Sombra seemed to understand complex conversations, how he would appear just before important moments, and how his calls changed depending on what he was trying to communicate. She drew diagrams of his different perching spots and what they might mean. The local kids had developed their own sort of crow-spotting network. They kept track of Sombra's movements through the neighborhood, sharing sightings via their parents' phones. Some even claimed they'd seen other crows starting to behave differently, as if Sombra's presence was affecting the entire local crow population. "The other crows watch him too," Emma wrote in her journal. "They follow him sometimes, but they keep their distance. It's like they know he's different." Below this entry, she sketched a rough map of the neighborhood, marking spots where Sombra appeared most frequently. A pattern was emerging, though she couldn't quite understand it yet. One evening, as Jake reviewed his research notes, he noticed something that made him sit up straighter. The locations where Sombra appeared most often formed a specific pattern when mapped out. It wasn't random at all. The crow seemed to be establishing a protective perimeter around something. But what really caught his attention was how this pattern aligned with old town maps he'd found during his research. The areas Sombra seemed most interested in corresponded exactly with what local indigenous peoples had once marked as sacred grounds, long before the town was built. Jake stared at his discovery, then at the crow who sat outside his office window, watching him with those knowing eyes. For the first time, he wondered if they weren't just dealing with an unusually intelligent bird, but rather something that had been here long before any of them, something that had chosen his daughter as a bridge between two worlds. In her room, Emma added one final note to her journal entry for the day. "Sometimes when I look at Sombra, I feel like I'm remembering something, but I don't know what. It's like trying to remember a dream, or maybe trying to remember something that hasn't happened yet." She glanced out her window at the crow, who met her gaze steadily. The evening sun caught his feathers, and for a moment, that blue-purple sheen seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. Emma felt that familiar tug in her chest, the sense that they were building towards something important. The truth about Sombra was still unfolding, but one thing was becoming clear. This was more than just a story about a girl and a crow. This was about awakening to something ancient and powerful that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. Morning sunlight filtered through the trees as Emma followed Sombra deeper into her backyard. The crow hopped from branch to branch, occasionally looking back to ensure she was following. These morning walks had become their routine over the past weeks, though today felt different. Sombra seemed more purposeful in his movements, leading her along a specific path. From the kitchen window, Jake watched his daughter with growing unease. He held his morning coffee forgotten in his hand, his attention fixed on the strange parade of girl and crow. His research over the past weeks had revealed patterns that both fascinated and troubled him. Every historical account he'd found of similar human-crow connections had preceded significant events, some wonderful, others devastating. Emma stopped at the edge of their property, where the maintained yard gave way to the wilder growth that marked the beginning of the old woods. Sombra landed on a fallen log and tilted his head, fixing her with that penetrating gaze she'd come to know so well. Then he did something new. He used his beak to arrange small twigs on the log, creating what looked distinctly like an arrow pointing toward the woods. "Dad!" Emma called out excitedly. "Come look at this." Jake set down his coffee and hurried outside, trying to keep his anxiety from showing on his face. By the time he reached Emma, Sombra had arranged more twigs, forming what appeared to be a crude but recognizable map. "He's been showing me special places," Emma explained, pointing to different parts of the twig arrangement. "See? This is where we found Mrs. Peterson's lost wedding ring. And this is where he led us to that broken power line before it could cause a fire." Jake knelt beside the log, studying the pattern. His throat tightened as he recognized the arrangement. It matched almost exactly with the sacred sites he'd identified in his research. "Emma," he said carefully, "has Sombra been trying to show you something in the woods?" The crow called out sharply, as if in response. The sound carried an urgency that made both father and daughter jump. Dark clouds had begun gathering on the horizon, despite the morning's clear forecast. "He wants us to follow him," Emma said with absolute certainty. She started forward, but Jake caught her arm gently. "Honey, wait. We need to be careful. We don't know." He trailed off, unsure how to express his concerns without frightening her. The crow's behavior had been beneficial so far, but something about today felt different, more significant. Sombra spread his wings, the blue-purple sheen of his feathers more pronounced than ever. He called again, the sound almost musical in its complexity. Emma hummed in response, a melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her memory. Thunder rumbled in the distance, though the storm clouds remained far off. Jake pulled out his phone to check the weather radar and found only static. His weather instruments in the garage had gone haywire again, just like the night of the first storm. "Dad," Emma said softly, her voice carrying a wisdom beyond her years, "I think I understand now. Sombra isn't just showing us places. He's showing us the way things used to be, the way they're supposed to be." She touched one of the twigs in the crude map. "This place has always been special. He's just helping us remember." The crow bobbed his head in what looked remarkably like a nod. He hopped closer to Emma, his movements deliberate and graceful. For a moment, Jake could have sworn he saw something shimmer in the air around them, like heat waves rising from hot pavement. "A new storm's coming," Emma continued, her eyes distant. "But it's not like the last one. This time, we need to be ready. Sombra's trying to show us something important, something that's been hidden for a long time." Jake looked between his daughter and the crow, remembering all the legends he'd read about birds as messengers between worlds. The scientific part of his mind struggled to rationalize what was happening, but he couldn't deny the evidence before his eyes. Sombra took flight, circling once above them before landing on a higher branch. His call this time was different, a long, complex series of notes that seemed to echo through the trees. Other crows appeared in the surrounding branches, their calls joining his in an eerie chorus. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else, something older and more profound. Jake felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up as he watched his daughter communicate with this extraordinary creature. He realized they were standing on the edge of something momentous, a threshold between the world they knew and something far more mysterious. "Tomorrow," Emma said, her eyes still fixed on Sombra. "He wants us to come back tomorrow morning. He says it has to be then." She turned to her father, her face serious. "Will you come with me, Dad? I think we're supposed to do this together." Jake looked at the gathering storm's clouds, then at the crow who had brought so much wonder and uncertainty into their lives. Finally, he looked at his daughter, who seemed to be growing and changing before his eyes, becoming something more than just a little girl with an unusual friend. "Yes," he said finally, understanding that some paths, once revealed, must be followed to their end. "We'll come back tomorrow, together." The next morning arrived heavy with anticipation. Dark clouds loomed overhead as Emma and Jake stood at the edge of their yard, watching Sombra circle above them. Emily stood on the back porch, wringing her hands, having finally agreed to let them follow the crow after a long family discussion the night before. "Be careful," she called out, her voice nearly lost in the rising wind. "And keep your phone on, Jake." Emma wore her yellow raincoat, a small backpack containing her journal and a flashlight bouncing against her shoulders as she walked. Jake carried a larger backpack with emergency supplies, his weather instruments, and a first aid kit. His phone's weather app showed only interference, the screen flickering with static. Sombra swooped low over their heads, leading them toward the tree line. The crow's feathers seemed to pulse with that strange blue-purple light, more vibrant than ever before. As they entered the woods, other crows appeared in the branches above, following silently, creating a dark canopy that moved with them. The air changed as they ventured deeper into the forest. The wind, which had been gusty in the open yard, became still and heavy with electricity. The morning light barely penetrated the dense canopy, creating an otherworldly twilight. Each step seemed to take them further from the familiar world of their neighborhood. "This way," Emma said confidently, following Sombra's distinctive call. She moved with surprising sureness through the underbrush, as if she knew exactly where she was going. Jake noticed that wherever she stepped, the ground seemed to momentarily shimmer, like sunlight on water. Thunder rolled overhead, but it sounded different here, deeper, almost melodic. The sound seemed to resonate with Sombra's calls, creating a harmony that made Jake's skin prickle with goosebumps. He checked his phone again, but the screen had gone completely dark. "Emma, wait," he called out, reaching for his daughter's hand. But she was already moving ahead, drawn forward by something he couldn't see or understand. Sombra's calls became more frequent, more urgent. The trees around them began to change. The familiar maples and oaks gave way to older growth, trees Jake didn't recognize. The air grew thick with the scent of wet earth and something else, something ancient and powerful. "Dad!" Emma's voice cut through his mounting anxiety. She had stopped in front of a massive oak tree, its trunk wider than any he'd seen in these woods before. Sombra perched on one of its lower branches, his dark eyes fixed on them. The crow spread his wings and let out a call that seemed to split the air. The other crows responded in unison, their combined voices creating a sound that made the ground beneath their feet vibrate. Emma stepped forward, reaching out towards Sombra. "Emma?" Jake lunged forward, but stopped short as he saw what was happening. Where his daughter's hand met the crow's wing, a soft light began to pulse. It spread outward, illuminating the clearing in a gentle, blue-purple glow that matched the sheen of Sombra's feathers. The temperature dropped suddenly, their breath visible in the strange light. The thunder overhead built to a crescendo, but here in the clearing, an otherworldly silence fell. Jake watched transfixed as his daughter and the crow seemed to communicate without sound. Emma's eyes were wide, filled with understanding. "Dad," she whispered, "I can see it now. You see all. And see what Sombra's been trying to show us." The light grew stronger, revealing patterns in the ground beneath their feet, ancient symbols that glowed with the same ethereal light. Jake recognized some of them from his research, sacred markings from the people who had lived here centuries ago. The other crows descended, forming a circle around them in the branches above. Their normally black feathers now shimmed with the same mysterious light as Sombra's. The air itself seemed to pulse with energy, like the moment before lightning strikes. "This place," Emma said, her voice carrying an echo of something older and wiser than her 8 years. "It's been waiting. Sombra is its guardian. He's been protecting it all this time, waiting for someone who could see, who could understand." Jake stood rooted to the spot, watching as his daughter stepped into the center of the clearing. Sombra glided down to land beside her. And in that moment, Jake saw something that defied all logic. The crow's form seemed to shift and change, becoming something both more and less than a bird, a presence that filled the clearing with ancient power. The storm above reached its peak, but no rain fell in the clearing. Instead, the air itself seemed to crystallize around them, creating a moment suspended between seconds, between worlds. In that frozen instant, Jake finally understood what his research had been trying to tell him all along. This wasn't just about a mysterious crow or a little girl who could communicate with it. This was about awakening something that had been dormant in these woods for generations, something that had chosen his daughter as its new keeper. Emma turned to look at him, her face illuminated by the otherworldly light. "Dad," she said softly, "I think this is just the beginning." And as if in answer, Sombra spread his wings once more, releasing a call that would change their world forever. The clearing pulsed with otherworldly energy as Jake made his way to Emma's side. His scientific mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The glowing symbols beneath their feet, the circle of illuminated crows above, and Sombra, who now seemed more like a living shadow than a bird, his form flowing and changing in the strange light. "Look, Dad," Emma whispered, pointing to the massive oak tree. In its ancient trunk, patterns began to emerge, not carved, but seemingly growing from within the wood itself. They matched the symbols on the ground, creating a complex network of flowing lines and ancient markings that spiraled up into the branches. Jake felt a sudden warmth in his pocket. Pulling out his phone, he found it working again, but instead of static, the screen displayed rapidly changing patterns that mirrored the symbols around them. His weather instruments, silent since they'd entered the woods, suddenly sprang to life, their displays showing readings that should have been impossible. Sombra glided to the lowest branch of the oak, his movement leaving trails of blue-purple light in the air. The crow's call had changed again, becoming something that seemed to bypass their ears entirely and resonate directly in their minds. To Jake's astonishment, he realized he could almost understand it. "The nest," Emma said suddenly, her voice carrying that same ancient wisdom he'd heard before. "Dad, look at the nest." High in the oak's branches, partially hidden by the swirling lights, sat a crow's nest unlike any Jake had ever seen. It seemed to be woven not just from twigs and leaves, but from strands of light itself. As they watched, Sombra flew up to it, his form shifting and flowing like liquid shadow. "It's not just a nest," Jake said, understanding dawning as he connected this sight with his research. "It's a nexus, a meeting point between," he struggled to find the right words, "between what is and what could be." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this confirmed something she'd known all along. Sombra showed me this in my dreams, she said, but it wasn't ready until now. It needed both of us here. The other crows began to move, flying in a tightening spiral around the oak tree. Their wings created currents in the luminescent air, forming patterns that matched the symbols below. Jake recognized elements from every culture he'd studied: Celtic spirals, Native American medicine wheels, ancient runes, all flowing together in a single, unified design. Sombra returned to them, landing between father and daughter. Up close, Jake could see that the crow's eyes held galaxies, deep pools of star-filled space that spoke of knowledge far beyond human understanding. Yet there was also something familiar in those eyes, something that reminded him of Emma's grandmother and her stories about the old ways. "He's been waiting for someone who could bridge the gap," Jake said, pieces of his research falling into place. "Someone young enough to see with unclouded eyes, but connected to the old knowledge through blood and bone." He looked at his daughter with new understanding. "That's why he chose you, Emma." Emma reached out slowly, and this time Jake didn't stop her. When her hand met Sombra's wing, the connection was visible, a current of light that flowed between them like liquid starlight. The crow's form stabilized, becoming solid again, but now Jake could see what he'd missed before. This wasn't just a bird that looked unusual. This was a being that chose to take the form of a crow. The nest above them began to pulse with a rhythmic light, like a heartbeat. Each pulse sent waves of energy through the clearing, and with each wave, Jake felt his perception shift. He began to see the woods as they truly were, not just trees and earth, but a living network of energy and consciousness that had existed here for millennia. "Dad," Emma said, taking his hand. The moment their fingers touched, the connection expanded to include him. Through this link, he could feel what Emma felt, see what she saw. The woods were alive with presence. Not just the physical life of plants and animals, but something deeper, more fundamental. Sombra called out one final time, and in that sound, Jake heard the voices of countless generations. All those who had served as guardians of this place. All those who had kept its secrets safe until the right moment, the right person, could awaken them again. The crow looked at them both, and this time, Jake understood perfectly. This wasn't an ending, but a beginning. Emma had been chosen, yes, but not to carry this responsibility alone. She needed her father's knowledge, his understanding of both the scientific and mystical worlds, to help her navigate what was to come. Together, they stood in that sacred space, the past and future swirling around them like leaves in an autumn wind, while Sombra watched with those star-filled eyes, knowing that his long wait was finally over. The circle was complete. News of what happened in the woods spread through the town like ripples in a pond. At first, it came through whispered conversations and curious glances at the Morrison family. The story grew as people noticed the changes, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The clearing, once hidden in the depths of the old woods, seemed to make itself known to those who needed to find it. Children would stumble upon it while playing, elderly residents would discover it during their morning walks, and troubled souls would somehow find their way there when they needed peace the most. Emma stood at the edge of the clearing one bright morning, watching as Mrs. Chun led her elementary school class on what had become a regular field trip. The children sat in a semicircle on the ground, their faces upturned in wonder as they watched Sombra perform his now familiar aerial dance above the ancient oak. The Native Americans who lived here called this place the Crossing, Jake explained to the class, referencing High's research notes. Since the discovery, he'd become something of a local historian, combining his scientific background with the ancient knowledge that seemed to flow from the site itself. They believed it was a place where our world touched others, where wisdom could pass between realms. The symbols that had appeared that stormy morning remained visible in the oak's trunk, though now they only glowed during significant moments. Researchers had come from universities across the country to study them, but the patterns defied conventional analysis. They seemed to shift and change depending on who was looking at them, revealing different aspects of their meaning to different observers. Each symbol tells a story, Emma explained to a young girl who had stayed behind after the class left. The girl reminded Emma of herself just months ago, full of questions about things others couldn't see. But the stories are alive. They change and grow, just like we do. Sombra perched on his usual branch, watching the interaction. The crow's appearance had stabilized since that first revelation, but those who knew what to look for could still see hints of his true nature in the way light played across his feathers, or in the depths of his knowing eyes. The town council had declared the clearing and surrounding woods a protected area, though such official recognition seemed almost redundant. The place protected itself. Development plans that would have encroached on the woods mysteriously fell through. Would-be vandals found themselves turned around, emerging from the woods far from their intended targets. Emily had started a community group dedicated to preserving local folklore and traditions, recognizing that the old stories held more truth than anyone had suspected. Every full moon, people gathered in the clearing to share tales, sing songs, and witness the way the symbols in the oak seemed to dance in the moonlight. It's like the town itself is waking up, one elderly resident remarked during a gathering. Like it's remembering what it used to be, what it's supposed to be. The other crows that had witnessed that first revelation became regular visitors to the clearing, forming a loose network of guardians that extended throughout the region. Children reported seeing them watching over playgrounds, following solitary hikers, or appearing at moments of significance. During a local harvest festival, the town officially incorporated a crow into its seal, recognizing the profound change that had come over their community. The image they chose showed a crow in flight, its wings forming a bridge between earth and sky. Emma had drawn the original design in her journal, though she insisted Sombra had shown her what it should look like. The most important thing, Emma told a reporter who had come to write about the town's transformation, is that we're all connected. The trees, the animals, the people were all part of the same story. We just forgot how to read it for a while. Jake stood nearby during the interview, noticing how his daughter's words carried that mixture of childish simplicity and ancient wisdom that had become her hallmark. The reporter's skepticism had visibly faded as Sombra performed his customary arrival, landing on Emma's shoulder with a grace that defied ordinary bird behavior. The clearing had become more than just a local wonder. It was a sanctuary, a place where the modern world and ancient mysteries could coexist. People came from all over seeking healing, wisdom, or simply a moment of connection with something larger than themselves. Through it all, Emma remained its principal guardian, guided by Sombra and supported by her family and community. She kept her journal meticulously, recording not just events but the deeper currents of meaning that flowed through the place. Future generations would read these accounts and understand that magic hadn't left the world. It had simply been waiting for someone who could see it clearly enough to show others the way back. As autumn painted the woods in brilliant colors, Emma sat in her favorite spot beneath the ancient oak, Sombra beside her, watching the symbols pulse gently in the trunk above. The crow's presence was steady and reassuring, a reminder that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only experienced and shared. The clearing had become a bridge, not just between worlds, but between people, between past and present, between what was lost and what could be found again. And in the heart of it all was a girl who had dared to believe in a crow that was more than a crow, and a family that had learned to see the extraordinary in the ordinary. The autumn evening settled softly over Emma's backyard as she sat on the porch swing, Sombra perched on the railing beside her. The air held that peculiar stillness that often preceded one of the crow's important revelations. Stars began to appear in the darkening sky, seeming to mirror the mysterious gleam in Sombra's eyes. A gentle wind stirred the fallen leaves, carrying them in a spiral pattern that reminded Emma of the symbols in the ancient oak. Sombra suddenly straightened, his feathers taking on that familiar blue-purple glow. He let out a soft call, different from any she had heard before, almost like someone humming a half-remembered lullaby. "What is it?" Emma asked, though in her heart, she felt she already knew. Something had been building toward this moment, like the final pieces of a puzzle falling into place. Sombra took flight, gliding to the ground near the old maple tree that had been her grandmother's favorite spot. The crow began to scratch at the earth with purpose, his movements precise and deliberate. Emma called for her parents, who quickly joined her in the yard. "He wants us to dig here," Emma said with certainty. Jake retrieved a garden spade from the garage, and under Sombra's watchful gaze, they began to carefully remove the soil. The spade struck something solid, a small wooden box, its surface weathered but intact. Emily gasped, recognizing it immediately. "That's Mother's memory box," she whispered. "She always said she'd hidden it somewhere special, but she passed before telling us where." With trembling hands, they opened the box. Inside lay a collection of letters, photographs, and a leather-bound diary much like the one Emma now kept. But what caught their attention was an old photograph sitting on top. A black and white image of Emma's grandmother as a young girl, standing in front of the ancient oak in the clearing. Beside her stood a small girl with familiar eyes, and perched on a branch above them both was a crow with distinctive markings. "Look at the date," Jake said softly, turning over the photograph. 1932. Emma's fingers traced the image of the crow in the photograph. The resemblance to Sombra was unmistakable. As if responding to her touch, the photograph seemed to warm beneath her fingers, and Sombra's call took on that musical quality again. They began reading through the diary, and the truth unfolded before them. Emma's grandmother had written about her own childhood friend, a mysterious girl named Sarah who had shown her the magic in the woods. Sarah had been accompanied by a crow she called Guardian, who watched over them as they discovered the ancient oak secrets. But Sarah had disappeared one autumn day, leaving only a note saying she had to return to where she came from. The crow remained, watching over Emma's grandmother throughout her life, then vanishing shortly before her death, only to reappear when Emma was born. "She knew," Emily said, tears in her eyes as she read her mother's words. "She knew you would be the next one, Emma. That's why she used to tell you all those stories about magic in the woods." Sombra spread his wings, and in the gathering darkness, his form began to shift and flow. The air around him shimmered, and, for a brief moment, they all saw her. Sarah, the girl from the photograph, smiling at them with eyes that held the same ancient wisdom they'd seen in Sombra's gaze. "The Guardian chose you," Emma's father said softly, understanding at last. "Just as it chose Sarah and your grandmother and probably others before them. It's been watching over this place, waiting for each new guardian to be ready." Emma opened her own journal and placed it beside her grandmother's diary. The entries, though written decades apart, carried the same sense of wonder, the same deep connection to the mysteries that lived in the woods. The circle was larger than they had imagined, stretching back through generations of guardians who had kept the old magic alive. Sombra resumed his crow form, but now they could all see him clearly for what he was, not just a messenger between worlds, but a bridge between generations, a keeper of sacred knowledge who took the form needed for each new guardian. "That's why you came to me," Emma said, looking at Sombra with new understanding. "You weren't just protecting the clearing. You were protecting our family's connection to it. You were keeping grandmother's promise." The crow bobbed his head in acknowledgement, and a warm breeze swirled around them, carrying the scent of autumn leaves and distant memories. In that moment, Emma felt the presence of all those who had come before her. Sarah, her grandmother, and countless others whose names had been lost to time, but whose legacy lived on in the magic they had helped preserve. Jake put his arm around Emily as they watched their daughter reach out to Sombra. The crow stepped onto her arm with familiar grace, and in the last light of day, they could see the threads of light that connected them all, past and present, seen and unseen, mortal and magical. "The story isn't over, is it?" Emma asked, though she already knew the answer. Sombra's eyes held the same mysterious gleam as the stars above, and in their depths, she could see more adventures waiting to unfold. This was her inheritance, not just the role of guardian, but the understanding that magic wasn't something that belonged to the past. It was alive and growing, changing with each new generation while remaining true to its ancient roots. Through Sombra, through the clearing, through her family's legacy, Emma had found her place in a story that had no end, only new beginnings. As night fell completely, Sombra took flight once more, circling the yard before landing on his familiar branch. His call rang out clear and true, no longer just the voice of a crow, but the song of magic itself, a melody that would continue to echo through time, calling to those who, like Emma, had the courage to listen and the wisdom to understand.